Now let's move on to look at the sixth lesson, the seventh word. You shall not commit adultery. When I was in seminary and we were studying, this was my very first year of seminary, we were studying our overview of the Hebrew Scriptures, our overview of the Old Testament. And we got to the passage with the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus. And I remember my professor was going through, he was not going through the words in real depth, but he had something to say about each one of them as we went along. And when we got to the seventh word, I remember him just kind of shuffling a little bit, looking down at his notes, and there was just this long silence. And he read the commandment. He read it in Hebrew. He read the commandment, 2 words in Hebrew. He read it. He took a deep breath and he said, "Just don't do it. All hell will break loose if you do. Just don't do it." And then he moved on to the next word. There always, it seems, is a bit of gallows humor around the seventh word, around talking about adultery. We have this kind of squeamishness as a culture about talking about sex at all. And back when the controversy in Alabama took place about the monument to the Ten Commandments, there were all kinds of jokes that were going around on the internet. And I remember one of them was 2 guys that were just talking together, and one says, "Do you think they'll ever put a plaque of the Ten Commandments in courtrooms or in the legislature?" And the other guy said, "Until they do something about that seventh one, those old boys are going to keep those commandments as far away from them as possible." But here's the thing. There is a whole lot more to this command, to this word, than meets the casual eye or the casual snicker. A little background may help. In Hebrew culture of this time, adultery was often seen as, in a sense, a property crime. That's why it's paired with the 8th word, no stealing. We'll talk about that a little more in the next lesson. Now, some scholars disagree with that, but I do think that there is a very persuasive body of evidence to suggest that while this word was a word about marriage and family, its root was in the prohibition against the misuse of a man's property, that was his wife, by another man. Adultery in and of itself in the Bible was fairly nuanced. Adultery did not apply when the man was married and the woman was single or a widow. In that case, the woman, simply by the act, became a secondary wife or a concubine. And I gave several examples of that in the study. Adultery only applied when a married woman had sexual intercourse. Other forms of sexual activity were exempt. It only applied when a married woman had sexual intercourse with a man other than her husband. And the issue, of course, was not sex per se, it was offspring. Our ancestors were not as squeamish about sex as we are, but they were very squeamish about paternity. A man needed to know that his children were his own. It was a matter of economic necessity, of honor and status. Now, interestingly, adultery in ancient times was not just understood as a personal matter. It was a community matter. And it was so serious, it was, at least in theory, a capital offense. The fact that a personal act is understood as a community problem may seem strange to us. We often seem to think that what happens behind closed doors is nobody else's business. The Bible doesn't see it that way, though. If you've ever been part, God forbid, if you have ever been part of a family or a group or even a church that has been torn apart by marital infidelity, you'll get this. It's not just personal. From our earliest days as God's people, we have, at least to a degree, recognized that adultery was a community matter. Now understand this clearly. The prohibition against adultery was not because God hates sex and spends all God's energy trying to fence off those wild impulses of ours. Adultery was and is about making sure that no selfish, self-serving, other disregarding behavior is allowed to threaten the fabric, the stability, and the longevity of the community. If you don't know who your children are, if you don't know that they are your own, then the promise itself, which is of offspring as many as the stars, then the promise itself is at stake and it is under threat. Adultery was about making sure that the temporary desires of the moment are not allowed to be put above the needs of the community, the tribe, and the family. The prohibition against adultery tells us plainly and simply that we are never to allow watered-down boundaries to throw the community into chaos. Why? Because when we come to believe that all commitments are subject to our personal desires, that no vows are inviolable, that no boundaries are impermeable, then every decision we make is ultimately selfish and often abusive. Others are of lesser importance than getting what we want when we want it. And when that happens, community in any meaningful sense of the word ceases to exist, and family in any meaningful sense of the word ceases to exist. Adultery is not just about who is doing what with whom behind closed doors. It is much more fundamentally about what one is willing to do to another in order to get what one wants. The question God asks beneath this word, and this is a broad question that applies to us even if we would never in a million years dream of violating our marriage vows, or even if we are not married. The question that God asks us to ponder in this word is, who are you willing to hurt to get what you want? What are you willing to compromise to meet a need that by design should be met in another way? And those are not simple questions, and they aren't served by just looking down and saying, just don't do it. Well, let's push a little deeper to think about the kinds of relationships. If we've seen that relationships must be preserved, that they are, in a sense, sacred, if we've seen that, then what are these relationships like? What kind of relationships are we talking about? Well, from the beginning, God has desired that human beings have special relationships. In the second of the creation stories, you all remember that there are two stories of creation in Genesis. The first is the one with the 6 days, and God said, and it was so. The second of the creation stories comes in the second chapter of Genesis, and that's what we call the Adam and Eve story. And in that story, what you see is that God, in this incredible burst of creativity, just kind of spins out the universe and creates the earth creature, the prototype human being. We call it Ha-Adam in Hebrew. We translate that as Adam, as if it were a first name, but it really just means earth creature. And so God makes the earth creature, and at that point, that one is not gendered. That one is to be the companion of God, and so there's not a partner for it, as with all the other animals. But it doesn't take long for God to see that the earth creature is lonely, that Ha-Adam wants and needs and desires a companion, a worthy companion, a fit companion, a companion of the same substance. And so that's when God causes the sleep to come on the earth creature, divides the earth creature, and makes then man and woman, Ish and Isha. That's when gender enters into the story. It's a beautiful story, and in that moment, when God looks at the earth creature and sees the loneliness, God uses an incredible word to address that. God says that I will make for that one. The Hebrew word is ezer, and we translated, the old translation was helpmate, which I hate because it sounds like an assistant. Newer translations are things like worthy companion or corresponding companion. But ezer relationships, these worthy relationships, are very important to understand. They are relationships that are to be marked by safety and intimacy and mutuality and respect and trust. Ezer relationships, by definition, are reciprocal. One is not greater than the other. They are of the same substance, just like the persons of the Trinity are of the same substance. That's why God didn't just make a new creature for Ha'adam. The worthy partner had to be of the same substance in order to be an equal. It is not until after sin enters the story, after the fall, that domination comes into the story at all, and then patriarchy is born. It was never God's original intent. At any rate, God's original intent was for ezer relationships. And ezer, a worthy companion, is one in whose presence we are safe to become all that God has dreamed for us to be. These ezer relationships are reciprocal and loving and committed and non-silencing relationships in which we choose as an act of will to give up the very natural human tendency to try to fix or coerce or manipulate or intimidate the other in order to get what we want. And ezer relationships come in a lot of forms. Now here's the thing that God knows, and according to me, here's what lies behind the seventh word. Ezer relationships, these worthy companionships, are not possible in a context of dishonesty, manipulation, personal aggrandizement, selfishness, superficiality, or disregard of the other. And adultery creates that kind of toxic environment. Now, the English word adultery means to cheapen, to lessen, to dilute. To commit adultery in ancient times and in our own cheapens and lessens relationships and threatens to dilute the power and stability of community. The pain of it can be so thick and intense that community simply collapses, especially the fundamental community of the family. And clearly, by implication, the spirit of this word moves far beyond and far deeper than the matter of fidelity in marriage. We cheapen our relationships not only with what we do with our bodies, but with what we do with our power, our time, our words, even our imaginations. We can adulterate our relationships by things we think of even as being good, like trying to be all things to all people or pleasing everybody and all the compromises that come with that. Or we can adulterate, we can cheapen our relationships by saying yes when we mean no and no when we mean yes. The deep caution at the heart of this word is against making our decisions without the good of others in mind. Remember that this word is about grace and not just limitation. God knows that not everything we want is good for us. God knows that when we cheapen our commitments and dilute our marriages and place our own desires above those of the community good, then when we do that, then anything becomes possible and sometimes even excusable in our minds at least. And when that happens, we will be unable to live the life of blessing that has been promised to us and bought by Jesus for us. In our love letter, God says, don't cheapen your relationships and allow yourselves to be buffeted constantly by the next shiny object.